Hi everyone, Aaron here for Zollotech, and the iPhone 13 Pro Max and iPhone 14 Pro Max are both great phones. The 14 Pro Max just replaced the 13 Pro Max, and I wanted to help you decide if you should upgrade or maybe upgrade from an older phone or just skip this year altogether and help you decide which is best for you. Now, this year, the price is the exact same, and the exact same in the United States only, meaning $1,099 up to $1,599. So you can go from 128 gigabytes all the way up to 1 terabyte. That hasn't changed, but outside the USA, it can be a little more expensive. We, of course, have new colors this year. The Sierra Blue was replaced with a purple color. Also, we have a new Space Black, but that's basically the same as Graphite or Space Gray, just different shades this year. So not a huge change there, but there is no Sierra Blue anymore. Maybe we'll have some different colors later on. Now, the design is exactly the same this year. We have stainless steel around the outside edge, we have ceramic shield on the front and back, and then we also, of course, have our camera bump. Overall, the camera bump and everything else is a little bit larger this year, as you can see here, and it's definitely protruding out more from the back of the display than it did in previous years. So there's a larger camera bump, but there is increased specs there as well. The phone is also slightly narrower this year, so it's ever so slightly narrower. You can feel it in your hands a little bit, and that makes the display slightly narrower, but it's not something you can really notice in everyday use. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The overall weight is exactly the same depending on how you're measuring it, so 8.47 ounces or 0.01 ounce more as far as the 14 Pro Max goes. However, it's still 240 grams for both devices. No difference there whatsoever. And like I said, the displays are very similar. We both have 6.7-inch displays, and the bezels on the 14 Pro Max are ever so slightly narrower this year, so a little bit reduced, but not much of a difference. So we both have 6.7-inch displays, but slightly different resolutions on the 14 Pro Max, but they're so close I don't think you'll notice a difference. But the big upgrade to the display comes for the 14 Pro Max's brightness. It can go up to 2,000 nits in direct sunlight. When you're outdoors, that's its maximum brightness, and it can go all the way up to 2,000 nits. It's incredibly bright, it's easy to see outdoors, and goes up to 1,600 nits with HDR video. The 13 Pro Max only went up to 1,200 nits, so if you're in bright environments all the time, the 14 Pro Max is definitely a big upgrade that way. Of course, the obvious thing with the display is the dynamic island. Apple has replaced the notch with what they're calling the dynamic island, which takes the place of the notch and puts sort of a playful area that you can interact with at the top of the display that still houses the camera and Face ID sensors. So we still have Face ID and everything else, but the dynamic island allows you to interact with it. Different apps that you open will go to that. If we go into the music app and then maybe play a song and then we swipe home, it goes up to the dynamic island. It's a new way to visualize what's going on. You have your audio waveforms and then you have your album art there. Press and hold, you go to the music player or the mini player, and if you tap on it, it actually brings you into the app that you tapped on. So we've got music in this case. Also, it can split into multiple dynamic islands with different apps running at the same time. So if we go into the clock app, maybe start a timer here, and we'll set it for 10 minutes, swipe home, and then it splits. This will be available in more apps later on, but right now it seems to only work with a few different apps from Apple. With future updates, probably by the time you're watching this video, you should have a bunch of apps that use this. But tap on either one of those and it will bring you back and forth. So that's something that's new this year. It's a new way to interact. And then you'll see as I swipe home after canceling the timer, it actually changes back. And then we swipe home, and now it's back to its normal size. So this is something that's really nice, but it's not a reason to run out and purchase the phone just because of the dynamic island. It's just a nice little playful thing Apple has added. This year, we also gained an always-on display with the 14 Pro Max. So if we turn the display off, just press the power sleep wake button. On the 14 Pro Max, you'll see that the display appears to still be on. Now, you may or may not like this, as it does appear to be on throughout the day and makes it seem like you forgot to shut off your phone or lock your phone. However, it does display helpful information, especially if it's on a nightstand or you're looking at notifications. You can see your time, your widgets, and maybe your notifications or focus mode. So it's really nice to have. But again, you may not like this. It's variable based on the ambient brightness, so as it gets more dim outside, this will actually dim down. But it does use a little bit of power, but it's very minimal. But that is an additional feature this year. Again, probably not a reason to run out and purchase the 14 Pro Max. Now, as far as overall color temperature between both of these devices, it seemed to vary quite a bit year to year. So if we go to an all gray and an all white screen, now I have an all gray background, True Tone is off, and the brightness is set evenly on both devices. You can see here, maybe you can or can't see this, but the color temperature is very similar, but slightly brighter or maybe a little bit lighter on the 14 Pro Max. So they're set evenly, but it does seem to be slightly different as far as color temperature. On a white background, I can definitely see a difference. The display on the right with the 14 Pro Max seems more white than the display on the 13 Pro Max. Now, granted, I have used the display on the 13 Pro Max for an entire year, so there could be some differences there, but overall, it seems very similar. I don't think you'll really notice, but it looks better on the 14 Pro Max. One other thing to consider is when you're watching a YouTube video, now that we have not only a notch, but a dynamic island that actually sits a little bit lower than the notch, sometimes YouTube content cuts into the notch itself. So let's take a look at that so you can see the difference. This is a comparison I made earlier this year in one of my videos from YouTube. You can see on the 14 Pro Max that the dynamic island cuts into some of the footage on the display. On the 13 Pro Max, it doesn't. It's actually formatted properly so that the notch isn't cutting into the actual display of the video. However, that's not true on some of the smaller iPhone 13s, but it is on the Max. So you can see the footage overall filmed in 18:9 as it's a little extra wide, and it was made that way earlier to fit these iPhones, but maybe that's a consideration I need to change based on the dynamic island cutting into people's footage now. So let me know what you think about that, but you can definitely see the difference here. So if I bring those down, it's something to consider if that's going to bother you or not, is there's lots of ultra-wide content on YouTube now. It doesn't bother me so much, but it would be nice to have it set up just like we did with the notch there. Now, also in this video, I thought I'd let you hear a speaker comparison between each phone. Since we're on my comparison video for the iPhones, let's go ahead and take a listen. I'll move my microphone so you can hear what they both sound like. So both of the speakers sound very similar between both devices. The 14 Pro Max may go slightly louder, and they both sound very similar though, so I really wouldn't consider that as far as upgrading to a 14 Pro Max, as they sound very, very similar between both of them. Now, both of these displays use PWM this year. They have for years since we're using OLED displays, and that's a way that the display is controlling brightness. So it's flickering the display faster and slower to control brightness. However, on both of these phones, it seems like Apple's using some sort of DC dimming, which means it's not flickering when it's at a constant rate. Now, I don't experience this at all as far as it bothering me, and I think it's at a high enough rate that it won't bother most people. But it's something worth mentioning, and you can see here at 240 frames per second, it's very hard to detect this year. So it's very difficult to detect any flickering at that high of a frame rate, which means for most people, it's not going to bother your eyes or give you any sort of eye strain. So in general, I think they're pretty good this year, and if that bothered you before, I don't think it will probably bother you now. However, you do get to try out the phones for a couple of weeks to see if that's a problem for you, and if it is, you could always go back to the LCD displays on the iPhone 11. Now, as far as battery life in both of these devices, they both get great battery life. According to Apple, you'll get 1 hour more of video playback time on the 14 Pro Max, but the overall battery life, even with the always-on display on, is said to be exactly the same according to Apple with regular use. Now, in my use, I actually find I get about an hour less of overall battery life on the 14 Pro Max compared to the 13 Pro Max. So it really is going to depend how you use it. The 14 Pro Max has a slightly smaller battery this year at 4,323 milliamp hours, where the 13 Pro Max is 4,352. But we have an upgraded A16 Bionic chipset in the new 14 Pro Max, which is more efficient and is on a 4nm process. They both use 6 gigabytes of RAM though. But overall, I find them to be very similar as far as performance. Both have ProMotion, which is super smooth when you move the display back and forth, and both of them open apps quickly. Whether you're loading things on the display, loading a game, if we go into the App Store, both of them seem to load very fast. In fact, that time around, you saw that the App Store loaded more quickly on the 13 Pro Max. So it seems like, depending on what you're doing, you really won't notice a difference. If we go into weather, we'll load that. And again, the 13 Pro Max was slightly faster. With overall performance, you're not going to notice a difference unless you're doing something very intensive. Maybe you're taking a photo using the camera and it's sort of controlling the overall exposure and then compressing it and then using the new photonic engine in the 14 Pro Max to make a better image. Then you might need that processor and notice a difference in speed there. Otherwise, with day-to-day use, you won't notice a difference with just opening apps. There's not a good test that will show you quickly what the difference is, as it's really more of a computational difference. But there's one thing you can see with benchmarks where there's definitely a difference in numbers anyway. So for the most part, you won't notice anything, but if we go into Geekbench here, on the 13 Pro Max, we'll just go into history, take a look at that. And you'll see this was the history here. This is actually a little bit low. Let's find a little bit better score. One of the better ones. There we go. And then you can see here, depending on which version I was running, you'll see if we go into the history on the 14 Pro Max, the overall speed is definitely higher when it comes to the numbers on benchmark scores. 1,711 for single core on the 13 Pro Max, 1,880 for single core on the 14 Pro Max. Again, multi-core is 4,719 on the 13 Pro Max, 5,237 on the 14 Pro Max. So really when it comes to Geekbench scores, you're going to see a difference. But again, most of those differences are going to be shown when you're doing computational things that use the neural engine. And one of those big things that can use the neural engine for is the cameras this year. We have upgraded forward-facing cameras. While they're both 12 megapixels, the new one uses the photonic engine, and overall video quality is quite good. In fact, I've used it in many of my videos with the unboxings this year and the review of the 14 Pro Max. It looks really good, so I would urge you to check that out as well, but I have a full comparison I'll show you in just a moment. The rear cameras are definitely the big upgrade this year. With the 14 Pro Max, we now have a 48 megapixel camera with an f1.78 aperture. Of course, we have an ultra-wide f2.2 and a telephoto f2.8. We have that photonic engine. We also have a new action mode and a 4K cinematic mode, with smooth zoom as well when you're zooming in with telephoto footage. So lots of different upgrades this year with the 14 Pro Max. And the big change is when you're using the camera on the 14 Pro Max, if you're using 48 megapixel raw images, that makes a huge difference. There's so much detail, so much dynamic range, and it looks great. So I'll show you some of that in some of the footage of the comparison in just a moment. But overall, the upgrade is definitely worth it if you're into cameras, because that 48 megapixel camera and what they've done with the sensors and then the new A16 Bionic definitely makes a difference. With the 13 Pro Max, we still have a 12 megapixel camera, which is quite good. It was a bump up from years past, and I've used it in many different video recording scenarios. So it works really well, and when you're taking 12 megapixel photos, you're really not going to notice much of a difference until you take 48 megapixel raw photos. If you're really into photography, you'll notice a difference. Now we also get some updated video features on the 14 Pro Max as well. If we go into the camera, you'll see we're in cinematic mode. We have now up to 4K for cinematic mode, 4K 30 and 4K 24 modes. We also have, in addition to that, if we go back to video, we have a new action mode that helps stabilize footage. If I turn that on, you'll see it drops down to 2.8K, and we have action mode that crops in to make everything very stable. So I'll show you that in the comparison in just a moment. And overall, I think the cameras are very similar depending on what you're doing. The forward-facing camera with autofocus makes the biggest difference though. So go ahead and take a look at some of the footage. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below if you can tell a difference, and which one do you think is better. With the 14 Pro Max this year, we gain autofocus, and the camera just seems to be much better. It's definitely usable for maybe just filming everyday videos or vlogs or whatever else you want, and the audio sounds pretty good too. So here's the audio I've been recording with the 14 Pro Max, and now here's the audio with the 13 Pro Max. So both of them seem to do a really great job, but the 14 Pro Max is definitely a step above with autofocus and more. Let me know which one you like better, the 14 Pro Max or the 13 Pro Max, in the comments below. This year we also gained 4K cinematic mode on the newer phones. So we have 4K instead of 1080p, but it still seems to be a bit blurry or fuzzy around the outside edges of my hair. On the 13 Pro Max, you can see it's 1080p. It looks dramatically different. I think it looks much better though on the 14 Pro Max. A new feature we have this year for the 14 Pro Max is crash detection mode. It uses the accelerometer, the barometer for barometric pressure, and even the microphone to sense a loud noise. And then if you're in an emergency, it will trigger it to call emergency services. You can cancel that, of course, but that's a new feature, and it requires high G-forces in order to actually activate that feature. But it's available on the 14 Pro Max. As is later this year, satellite connectivity if you no longer have cellular signal. So if you're out in the woods somewhere, maybe you're hiking, you're in the mountain, or maybe you're just driving and you have no signal altogether and you need some help, you'll be able to use that, at least in the United States and Canada initially, to contact someone for help. That will be available later this year, and when it is, we'll try it out. But at the time of this video, it's not yet available, but it is something that's on the 14 Pro Max only. We also get updated 5G modems in the 14 Pro Max, which are a little bit better as far as overall speed. I've noticed better connectivity, less dropped calls, and it just seems to be better overall when it comes to that. Also in the United States this year, it's eSIM only, so there's no physical SIM card. So if you travel a lot and you need that SIM card, that's something to consider. We do have the same Wi-Fi 6 standards, no 6E in the 14 Pro Max, so we have the same Wi-Fi, but we now have Bluetooth 5.3, so that could be more energy efficient and give us some higher fidelity over time. But right now it doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot. Now we also have IP68 water resistance. There's no difference there whatsoever, and everything else is basically the same. When you're using them, they feel very similar. The dynamic island is going to be the major thing you'll notice the difference in, and some people may not like this. And so hopefully this has helped you decide which one is right for you, whether or not it's worth your money and worth maybe upgrading this year, or maybe you just want to hold out until next year when typically Apple redesigns their phone every 3 years. So the iPhone 15 will probably look a little bit different as they update every 3 years now. So that seems to be what Apple does. We may or may not see that, but if you're waiting for a big redesign, that's probably when they'll do it. But let me know which one you choose and why in the comments below. If you picked up a 14 Pro Max, I'd love to hear from you there. Or if you're sticking with a 13 Pro Max or even picking this up now on discount, well then definitely I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Of course, if you'd like to get your hands on this wallpaper, I'll link it in the description like I normally do. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. As always, thanks for watching. This is Aaron. I'll see you next time.